As one of the most important public intellectuals of his time, Edward Said left us a legacy based on the powerful and persuasive links he forged between the different intellectual and political worlds. This interaction between culture and politics that he ceaselessly and creatively wrote about was unique, and his influence on the 10th anniversary of his death is as strong as ever. Humanism and democratic criticism was in press when Edward passed away. In this book, his last testament, so to speak, he writes in the preface that these lectures are neither a definitive statement nor a call to arms. And later in the same paragraph, he says, "But I would like to say that I have tried in a reflective way to discuss those aspects of my enormous subject that have meant the most to me." Before Orientalism, Edward Said's work was literary and theoretical. In his book, Beginnings, he discussed the importance of Vico as a model intellectual. In Humanism and Democratic Criticism, Vico reappears, and so does Auerbach, who was not part of the lecture series that formed this book. Orientalism, his groundbreaking work, effectively created the field of cultural and post-colonial studies, as we know it today and the subject of this conference. He asked, what is the part that literature and culture play, and how can they be accountable for the injustices of the modern world? After Orientalism, Edward Said became the most influential voice for the Palestinians in the West and the model of the politically engaged intellectual. He made every student of the humanities aware of the Palestinian struggle and chose to interpret this struggle through the politics of dispossession and exile, thus forcing us to look at the crisis of our times through a different lens. In the 1990s, music, which was always a part of his career and a passion, became an integral part of his work, and by chance he met Daniel Barenboim in London. Two talented, extraordinary individuals, a Palestinian and an Israeli, whose experiences of exile brought the best out of them, found that although they came from both sides of the divide, their friendship transcended all the barriers that separated them. Over the years, they recorded their conversations in a book called Parallels and Paradoxes, Essays in Literature and Society. Having broken the wall of hatred between them, Edward and Daniel decided to share this unique experience with their people. Again, fate intervened. In 1999, Weimar was designated the cultural capital of Europe, and Daniel Barenboim was asked to participate as a world-renowned pianist and conductor. That is when the idea of a musical workshop of Arab and Israeli musicians came about as a humanistic project and an experiment in coexistence whose language is music. The workshop was held in Weimar, the city of Goethe. At the end of the workshop, the group performed a concert, and that marked the beginning of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. I quote from Humanism and Democratic Criticism. Goethe became fascinated with Islam generally and Persian poetry in particular. This was the period when he composed his finest and most intimate love poetry, the West-Östlicher Divan. Goethe was the first European who saw the relationship between West and East as complementary and not adversarial, and that is what led Edward and Daniel to give this newly formed orchestra its name. However, I personally believe that the seeds of this project were planted many years before Daniel and Edward met. One day in the late 1980s or early 1990, purely by chance, Edward and I watched a television program that featured a young Palestinian pianist from Nazareth, Salim Aboud Ash'ar. Salim was 12 or 13 years then, and he had just won the most prestigious children's piano competition in Israel. Salim was phenomenally talented. Edward realized that Salim's prospects for pursuing a career in music would be limited unless support for his education could be found. The next morning, he called the director of the Welfare Association, a Palestinian organization that does extensive educational and social work in the Palestinian territories, and asked them to locate Salim and his family. They did. Edward auditioned Salim and turned to his friend Mohsen Qattan, and then the A.M. Qattan Foundation supported Salim's education. Salim was in London pursuing his studies when Edward introduced him to Daniel. Daniel became Salim's guide and mentor. Today, Salim is a successful pianist who performs with the major orchestras of the world. When Salim began his studies in London, an initiative was underway to establish the National Conservatory of Music in the occupied territories, and Edward was very supportive and instrumental in making this a reality. He saw the importance of musical education as a means of overcoming the occupation. He believed that music education teaches the child to focus and concentrate on the task at hand, and that skill, attained through music, would help that child perform better in school. Like most Israelis, Daniel had never been to the occupied territories. Edward encouraged Daniel to visit Ramallah. Daniel did. Edward introduced him to many of our friends there, and he returned later to play a concert at Birzeit University. At that time, the National Conservatory of Music was having a lot of difficulty recruiting good teachers from abroad. Edward was aware of this problem, and he mentioned it to Daniel. Daniel immediately took the initiative and instituted a program whereby teachers from Germany would go and teach at the conservatory in Ramallah. He also promised the director of the conservatory that he would help him establish a first-class Palestinian youth orchestra. In 2002, the regional government of Andalusia offered the West Eastern Divan Workshop and Orchestra a permanent home in Sevilla, Spain. Andalusia was the only place in Europe where the three monotheistic religions coexisted peacefully for hundreds of years. They adopted all our programs and established the Fundación Barenboim Said to run them. It was also their generosity that made it possible for the orchestra to go on tour. Besides the orchestra, the foundation's other programs are individual musical instrumental instruction, musical kindergartens, and music appreciation in the occupied territories and in Spain. The West Eastern Divan Orchestra is world-renowned and has performed at prestigious halls all over the globe, from Vienna to New York to Buenos Aires to Beijing, and played in famous music festivals, including the Salzburg Festival and the Proms in London, among others. The first concert in an Arab country was in 2003 in Rabat, Morocco. In 2005, a concert was performed in Ramallah in solidarity with the Palestinians and in memory of Edward Said. This space, created by Edward and Daniel, was described by Edward in a lecture given in 2003, a few months before his death, where he told the story of the workshop and orchestra, and I quote from this lecture. There is no political program to what we do, since everything is subordinated to music, which for 3 weeks possesses everyone. Despite the incredibly polarized, antagonistic, and discordant world in which we live, there is always the possibility of another alternative type of social model. In our work and commitment to our friendship and to music making and to the ongoing Weimar Civil project, there has been an amazing crossing of borders and a disruption of the rigid lines that have circumscribed and organized our public as well as private lives. If it weren't for the rich, emblematic status of Palestine and Israel, none of this would have been possible, since it is because the complex issue itself, whose core, from my point of view, is the struggle for Palestinian human rights in a land sanctified by the three great monotheistic religions, is so fertile with possibilities, one that reach into culture, history, politics, and personal relations, that we have been able to do what we do. Presiding over our efforts, students and teachers alike, has been the spirit of music, which, I would want to insist, is neither a sentimental panacea nor a facile solution for every problem, but rather a practical utopia whose presence and practice in our riven world is sorely needed and, in all sorts of ways, intensely instructive. At least, therefore, another world emerges as a result against the backdrop of Andalusia, itself an alternative model for coexistence between the three monotheisms. And if it isn't immediately available on the world stage, it can at least signal the arrival of a new attitude whose example might soon provide us with many others, many sanctuary changes, many profound new interpretations of what is now only an appallingly polarized, completely inhuman conflict. In our work and planning and discussions, our main principle is that separation between peoples is not a solution for any of the problems that divide peoples. And certainly ignorance of the other provides no help whatever. Cooperation and coexistence of the kind that music lived as we have lived, performed, shared, and loved it together might be. I, for one, am full of optimism despite the darkening sky and the seemingly hopeless situation for the time being that encloses us all. A few months later, Edward passed away. My family and I continued to support this endeavor, and I assumed an active role in this project. As mentioned earlier, the orchestra performed in Ramallah in 2005, and at the end of 2005, the National Conservatory of Music suspended its relationship with the Fondation Barenboim Said. Currently, we operate independently as Barenboim Said organization in the occupied territories. The political situation on the ground in Palestine worsened after Edward's passing, and Gaza is still under siege. Yet, my personal experience since becoming actively involved with the orchestra has made me aware of Edward's vision and how some of his ideas are constantly being tested. Knowing and understanding the other, equality between the members of the orchestra, another alternative social model, contrapuntal reading, which he discussed extensively in Culture and Imperialism, contradictory themes in music, producing harmony and attempting to reconcile the irreconcilable. The workshop is a mini academy of orchestral performance. There is no doubt that the success of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra is due to the indefatigable energies of Daniel Barenboim as a conductor, pianist, and a remarkable teacher. Daniel Barenboim is constantly reminding us that members of an orchestra learn to lead and follow, since in an orchestra, each and every instrument is equal to the other. While playing, one instrument leads and the other instruments listen and follow. Then another theme is introduced and the instrument that was leading has to follow. And one of the instruments that was a follower will lead. This kind of interaction teaches the musicians to listen to others and at the same time to take the initiative and lead, traits that are very important in society. The workshop and the orchestra have provided a forum where ignorance of the other is not existent anymore. It's getting to know and understand the other that has motivated the musicians to excel in music. Their struggles and agonies get reflected in their playing, and that is why they resonate so well with the audiences. In our discussions, nothing is honky-dory, as they say, nor are the discussions combative, hostile, or adversarial. I won't deny that there is a lot of tension in the discussions. However, these formal discussions are attempts at broaching difficult subjects in an enlightened way, and the experiment in coexistence is constantly being tested through these discussions. We keep trying anyway. Edward described himself doing just that in the last sentence of Humanism and Democratic Criticism. In the preface of the 25th anniversary edition of Orientalism, Edward writes, "Most important, humanism is the only, and I would go so far as to say, the final resistance we have against the inhuman practices and injustices that disfigure human history." I believe this humanistic project represents exactly that. A few years ago, Daniel Barenboim was offered a physical space in the building of the Staatsoper in Berlin to utilize as he wished. He accepted the offer and decided to build an academy of music for higher learning. Qualified students from the Middle East will study for 2 years and receive a diploma in music. In other words, the main aim of the academy is to educate the many future Salim Abbouds, whether they come from the Palestinian territories, Israel, the Arab countries, or any other country in the region. Participating in this project does not negate the various nationalities represented. The Barenboim Said Academy, as it is called, is being established and is scheduled to open in 2015. Frank Gehry, the world-known architect, upon hearing of this project, decided to design the concert for the Academy free of charge. This institution will provide a permanent home for the orchestra and ensure in its perpetuity and development to become the region's foremost orchestra. It will also bring all our projects together under one roof and create a home for furthering the education of our musicians, in which a rigorous curriculum in music and the humanities will also give the experience of breaking barriers, understanding the other, and learning to coexist. After earning an advanced diploma in music, some of the graduates will become members of their national orchestras, as our graduates are now, others in world-renowned orchestras, and the rest will return to the region, hopefully, to teach and educate. The German government is supporting this project financially and will help in running the academy. Knowledge is the Beginning is a documentary film that won several prizes, and it tells our story. I do hope some of you will get to see it. In closing, I quote Edward again. "Cultures are too intermingled, their contents and histories too interdependent and hybrid for surgical separation into large and mostly ideological oppositions like Orient or Occident. This is also true of the history of Palestine-Israel, and our project clearly shows the intermingling and interdependent histories, and again, Edward chose to interpret this struggle through education and a new language, music, thus forcing us yet again to look at the crisis of our times through a completely different new lens. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Since Daniel Barenboim was not able to be with us, he sent a few words in memory of Edward. And it's remembering Edward Said. I met Edward Said in 1992. I was in London to play with the London Symphony with Pierre Boulez, and I was checking into the hotel. It was, at that time, still called the Hyde Park Hotel. Now I think it's the Mandarin. It was lunchtime, and there were lots of people, and I was not in a very good mood. It had been a bad trip. I was late. I had to go to the rehearsal. I couldn't check in. I couldn't leave, and so on. In the middle of this, a very elegant gentleman approached me and said, You are Daniel Barenboim. May I introduce myself? You wouldn't know me. My name is Edward Said. I said, well, I didn't know what you look like, but I know who you are. Then we started talking, and suddenly it seemed to me that the queue for checking in was going much too fast for my taste. But I finally checked in, and I had to go to the rehearsal, and he had something else to do. He asked, when do you finish? I said, at 5 o'clock. He says, well, shall we meet here at 5? We did, and we really became practically inseparable. From that day until the day he died, I don't think there was a day we didn't speak to each other, let alone think about each other. I had very good friends in my life. I was very lucky. I met really wonderful people, and they became my very good friends. I have had great teachers in my life. I have had great musicians from whom I learned, even if I was not formally their pupil. But I never had somebody who was both at the same time. It is not to pay him tribute or say something nice about him to say that I think of Edward practically every day. I don't think of him in a sentimental way. I don't think of him in a nostalgic way. I don't like nostalgia. I don't know who said nostalgia is very negative because it means denial of the present. I don't think of Edward, I don't think of Edward in a nostalgic way. Oh, he was so nice, he was so charming, he was so intelligent. Oh, he said this and that. Not at all. I think of him in an almost existential way, of things that he said or things he would say in this or that situation. One of the first things one remembers about Edward is his breadth of interest. He was not only at home in music, literature, philosophy, or the understanding of politics, and I certainly learned a lot in our discussions of all of these. But he also was one of those rare people who see the connections and the parallels between different human disciplines because he had an unusual understanding of the human spirit and of the human being, and he recognized that parallels and paradoxes are not contradictions. Because he saw all these connections so lucidly, there could not have been anybody else with whom I could have founded the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. One of the many things I learned from Edward was his concept of counterpoint. To him, the musical terminology of counterpoint is not only a technical terminology. Rather, it describes the very sense of human nature. This is why music was so important for Edward, I think. Because he understood that music offers one of the clearest definitions of the human being as having a point and a counterpoint in himself. There is no understanding without dialogue, and no dialogue without the willingness to listen to one another, whether in agreement or disagreement. I believe that Edward lived these principles in everything he did, and I think it is very fitting that in the 10th year after his voice in the ongoing dialogue went silent, he is remembered in discussions in his spirit that, I hope, will range widely over the topics that were important to him. I am glad to have the chance to share my memories with you, even if, unfortunately, I cannot be with you in person to remember and honor my friend and soulmate. Thank you.